If you watch Frame Chasers here on YouTube, you may have heard Jufes say the 7900X 3D and 7950X 3D are a scam. In fact, he called out PC World recently for basically stealing his title on their thumbnail. So Jufes, I hope that you're watching this because I don't disagree with you, and I also kind of stole your idea. So sorry, not sorry, but at least I'm not like a AMD fanboy here. Well, I kind of am, or was, but now since this X3D chip came out, it is kind of a scam. And one reason why is because it's complicated. It's not a CPU that the everyday average user can easily use. It's not plug and play. And even when you tweak it, there's much more to be desired. You know, and like, I'm going to say this a couple times probably, but everybody should wait for the 7800X 3D to come out next month. Hopefully I can get my hands on one quickly. Once it releases, it just kind of depends on the time of the day that it releases, really. So today I'm going to wrap up the tests that we've been doing on the 7900X 3D against the 13900KF. Now, someone recently commented that the 7950X 3D is more comparable to the 13900KF, where I disagree with this because the 13900KS, as in Sam, is Intel's top-of-the-line gaming processor. So the 7950X 3D is AMD's top-of-the-line processor. So I think those two should be able to compare with each other at least. Then the 7900X 3D, second from the top, and the 13900KF, second from the top. So let's get straight into some Star Citizen gameplay. I'm going to kind of revisit and talk about some of the previous tests that we've done, followed by Forza Horizon 5, and then I'm going to do a 3D Mark test. It won't be the only 3D Mark test I do. In the future, you'll see some more in upcoming content. So our 13900KF system here has 64 gigs of RAM, which is twice as much as the 7900X 3D. But later on, I'm going to do a side-by-side test. I'm going to put the same 32 gigs of RAM in the Intel system later on and do a 3D Mark side-by-side to show pretty much what the difference in performance is with the different RAM size. I'll also end our Star Citizen test with the 7900X 3D by itself. I'm about to add that screenplay to the right side here so that we can look at the differences in performance throughout this gameplay. Stay with me here because I'm going to continue to talk over the gameplay about these differences. There's so much to cover and still a lot I'm probably going to leave out of this commentary. We're starting off at 1080p, and I had another viewer last week comment that I should not test these higher end systems at this resolution as it's pointless. Where I appreciate the feedback and friendly debate, I highly disagree with this statement, and here's why I think it's important. The CPU is doing the same amount of work per frame at 1080p as it is at 4K, but it has to do a lot more work overall at lower resolutions. Here's why. The GPU can render 60 FPS at 4K, but when doing 120 FPS at 1080p, the CPU has twice as much work to do because there's twice as many frames. Now 1080p also alleviates the potential for GPU bottlenecks, allowing us to look closer at the actual CPU performance. One last thing I'm going to note right now is that the bigger tech channels also test CPU performance out at 1080p for this reason. If you would like to debate this, feel free to comment below. I really don't mind. Also, hop onto a channel like Gamers Nexus and make the same argument there and see what a much larger audience has to say about it. If you do want to debate this, I just recommend doing some research first. Then provide your source in your comment so we can all possibly learn something here. If I'm wrong, I'll admit I'm wrong, but here's the thing, if I stop doing it, then there's going to be a lot of other people that say, why aren't you testing everything at 1080p also? Now that we have that out of the way, the 7900X 3D is averaging about 50 more FPS. Now, mind you, the 1% and 0.1% lows are not showing up. I had the same issue in a previous video where I think this game is just not registering it. For whatever reason, RiverTuner is just not picking up these values. But we can still see that we're getting really good frame times with the 7900X 3D. Note, that processor is running really hot during this gameplay. Here's the reason why. The scheduler for this processor sucks. And this game also doesn't trigger game mode for the X3D chip, where in this scenario, it would normally only run off one CCD and half of the processor. So we're not getting a true test here since the chip is running on all cores essentially right now. It's not supposed to. It's therefore not utilizing the CCD with the 3D cache. So to Frame Chaser's point, this is another reason why the chip is kind of a scam, because it's supposed to shut off one of the CCDs. There's two CCDs, each one has half of the cores on it, so now our 12 core processor is essentially turning into a 7600 with just 6 cores. But now we can see when it doesn't work correctly and you're using all cores, it runs too hot. So either way, we're not getting the performance that we're supposed to out of this chip. So AMD claims that when it works properly and it parks the other CCDs. So these cores are not completely disabled. They're able to be woken up if the scheduler requires more CPU performance. But the problem is, while that happens, it creates a lot of latency. And as others have tested, if you run an R23 benchmark while gaming, you start losing FPS. So this is telling us that if you have a lot of background stuff going on, or if you're streaming, you're probably going to lose a lot of FPS because, again, the scheduler sucks. Some of you may be thinking, well, if I run an R23 benchmark while gaming, of course I'm going to lose FPS. You're not wrong. But the way the X3D chips and the scheduler is advertised, it should be able to run a game on one CCD and then run the benchmark on the other CCD. Now, you can force this to happen that way through the scheduler, but it's real complicated and, again, not for the average user. Now that's the way I understand it to work. If you disagree or have other information, again, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Outside of that, this is also why I say to wait for the 7800X 3D because it only has one CCD. So the scheduler is not going to have an issue trying to figure out which CCD to prioritize. So now that we're running 1440p, you can see the FPS numbers on both systems are a lot closer, and our CPU temperature is dropping. As for the debate I mentioned earlier, this is good proof right here that the CPU simply is not being relied upon. It's more GPU bound, and this is just why it's better to show CPU performance in gaming at 1080p. So let's land the ship on the 7900X 3D system, and then we'll move on to Forza Horizon 5 benchmarks. This is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Alright, so Forza Horizon 5, we're starting out at 1080p, and right off the bat, as you can see, the FPS difference is marginal. CPU usage is about the same. The 7900X 3D is demanding a little bit more CPU. This may be due to it only running on 6 cores, as the scheduler works in this game and triggers game mode in the Xbox game bar. I'm not sure why we're not seeing 1% and 0.1% lows. Once again, now I'm starting to think it's maybe not a Star Citizen issue, because in Cyberpunk it works, so I'm not sure what's going on there. I'll look into that later. As for the results, both systems averaged out at 139 FPS, where the 7900X 3D actually put out 100 more FPS for the CPU simulation, and had 5 less frame stutters. But overall, both systems are pretty smooth here. Now for the 1440p benchmark, we're looking at similar performance here, but let's go ahead and fast forward to the benchmark results. And then we'll move on to some gameplay to show more realistic performance between both these systems. Surprisingly, there's a bigger gap in results at 1440p. 10 more FPS on the 7900X 3D, a little less stutter count, and better average latency. Starting off at 1080p with both systems at the same settings, we can see that the 13900KF actually performs a little bit better, which is where the benchmarks don't tell the whole story. It's marginal, but it's still worth noting that it really is just a little bit better. Now let's go to a part of the map that seems to be challenging no matter what system I play this game on. Now it's interesting to see that the 7900X 3D is performing a little bit better in the harder parts of the map. This is just a good example of how every processor really has its pros and cons. Both differences are somewhat marginal, and it just comes down to preference. Just as we saw in the benchmarks, the 7900X 3D is actually performing better at 1440p. I'm really glad we tested everything out at 1080p so that we can tell the difference here. And now we'll move on to the same part of the map we tested before that's a little bit more challenging for most systems. Similar performance pattern here again, except I think the 7900X 3D is doing even better at this part of the map. Now with that said, I'm still not recommending this chip to anybody, and to just hold off for the 7800X 3D if AMD is the way you want to go. Now let's finish off with 3D Mark Night Raid at 1080p. This is where it gets a little bit more embarrassing for AMD. It tells a good story on what Jufes was talking about on how Intel just performs better overall. Now one thing that he tested very well in depth is overclocking. The Intel chip is just better for overclocking. It has a better memory controller, you can run memory much faster, and overall it just performs better. I do see AMD catching up with Intel here, but they just didn't meet the mark. So for the money performance to dollar, as far as gaming goes, I recommend Intel. Overall, as a company, I'll push Intel over AMD right now for this reason. I want my customers to get the best for their money without sacrificing performance. Now with that said, the 13th gen Intel is kind of a dead-end platform. The LGA 1851 socket is already in the works for releasing later on this year the 14th gen Intel. That socket will take us to the 15th generation as well. So if you upgrade later on this year, you'll be looking at another generation ahead of it for compatibility. Now I mentioned a second ago that it was kind of a dead-end platform. The reason why I say kind of is because even the 700 and 600 series motherboards for Intel have PCI 5.0. That will give some future upgrade paths for faster M.2 hard drives and better GPUs that are going to come out in the future. I also think Intel did such a good job with the 13th generation. The CPUs are going to perform very well in the future for a long time. Now, as for the AM5 platform, the future is still unknown. The previous AM4 platform had multiple different generations that socket was compatible on. So it's very possible one day the Ryzen 8950X or 9950X that's going to still be the AM5 socket will outperform the future generation of Intel. I don't know, but here's one thing I promise, is to give you my honest opinion. Non-affiliated, independent reviews. I'm not going to BS anybody and say that AMD is better because I personally like AMD. That won't happen. What will happen is I'll continue to do side-by-side tests as new technology comes out to help hold the industry accountable. The problem with a lot of the bigger channels is they provide misinformation a lot of times because they might be afraid that if they trash talk AMD, then AMD is going to stop giving them samples to test. For me, I have nothing to lose. And if I ever get big enough where I'm affiliated with these companies, then I'm gonna still tell you the truth. Even if that means I don't get the samples in the future, I'll pay money out of my own pocket to prove that a product is either good or not, if I have to. Before getting into the results, I want to say one last thing about the X3D chips. There is a potential that with BIOS updates and game updates and maybe even chipset driver updates, we will see better scheduling in the future, hence better performance. We don't know yet. Some speculate AMD is working on some fixes and tweaking everything. And as recent history is proven, a lot of these companies have been releasing a product before all the bugs were worked out and also before the drivers have been perfected, and I'm just not sure why. I don't know if it's a quality control issue or if they're just rushing products out the door to stay on schedule, but this does seem to be kind of the new norm for hardware releases. Now for the results. As you can see, the 13900KF outperformed the 7900X 3D by far. So to prove a point that the 7900X 3D is just not optimized to its full potential, I went into the curve optimizer and turned the PBO settings to -10 on all cores. This gave us a little bit performance boost, but still not enough to catch up with the 13900KF. So I could have continued tuning this chip with the curve optimizer, and then I could have even gone into some voltage settings, but I decided to stop there as there was no way I was going to catch up with the Intel chip. So here's the 13900KF score again on the left hand side. Now on the right, this is the 13900KF with 64 gigs of RAM, just to show the difference of performance that you would get out of doubling the RAM. In addition, the RAM speed was 6400 at CL32 as compared to 6000 at CL36. This shows that tighter timings and more RAM capacity and speed does increase gaming performance pretty good. So anyways, that's all we got for today. If you made it this far, I really appreciate you watching this whole video and hope to see you next time.